Grant, I think you have forgotten who you work for at Vanguard Logistics. Helena Vance's voice came through my phone so polished it almost hid the insult. Almost. I was standing in the sunlit cobblestone courtyard of a boutique hotel in Florence with the Moretti Group's signing folder tucked beneath my arm. Final delivery sequences, margin schedules, and the clean legal clauses of an $18 million commercial supply agreement hung in the balance. It was the culmination of 18 days I had spent keeping an essential international deal alive. After corporate executives in New York had nearly bruised it to death with late demands born of executive vanity. I work for Vanguard Logistics, I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly even. She replied that I worked for people who could replace me in 5 minutes without losing a single beat. That was the exact moment the air turned cold. A hotel attendant crossed behind me, carrying a tray of sparkling water, and somewhere beyond the wrought iron gate, a delivery truck clattered past. The world stayed completely ordinary, while a woman 4,200 miles away decided to convert a live cross-border expansion into a personal exercise in corporate intimidation. My name is Grant Miller. I am 49 years old, and after 24 years in global procurement and supply chain operations, I know the difference between operational pressure and personal humiliation. Pressure comes with a hard deadline, tight inventory margins, and complex international compliance rules. Humiliation comes with an unearned voice that wants to hear you stumble so someone else can feel powerful. Helena said this European trip had gone on far too long and accused me of acting as if the deal belonged to me personally instead of the company. I reminded her that Monday morning was the final commercial signing with Enzo Moretti and that she did not hold an executive position or a voting seat on our corporate board. She paused on the line, then said I needed a firm reminder about my place, adding that I was merely a line employee, not the public face of Vanguard Logistics. Then she removed me from the project entirely. There was no transition conference, no risk assessment, and no discussion regarding commercial continuity. It was simply a swift act of unearned force dropped into the most fragile stage of a negotiation she did not comprehend. I kept my voice flat and steady. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. That composure seemed to irritate her far more than if I had argued or panicked. The connection went dead. 7 minutes later, an official message from Clara Gable in Human Resources arrived in my inbox. Effective immediately, I was relieved of all responsibilities regarding the Moretti account, pending internal review. Mason Cross would assume immediate coverage for Monday's signing. I read Clara's email twice to ensure I had not misread the rigid corporate language. Mason Cross was 38 years old, a slick strategy coordinator from headquarters who had never sat across a table from Enzo Moretti or walked the floor of an overseas manufacturing plant. He did not understand which financial concessions had already cost the Moretti family more pride than profit over 5 months of tense negotiations. He did not know which operational clause in that blue leather folder had been softened over late-night dinners to preserve Monday's execution schedule. I looked at the local time on my phone. The formal signing was still scheduled for Monday at 9 in the morning. Headquarters believed they had simply removed one difficult director from an overseas assignment. What they had actually done was extract the only steady negotiator from a deal held together by mutual trust, exact legal wording, and 18 days of painstaking diplomacy. When Monday morning arrived, Vanguard Logistics was going to learn the difference between corporate authority and actual business reality. People like Helena Vance believe commercial value is entirely cosmetic. They think it resides in job titles, executive suites, glossy press releases, and sitting at the head of the boardroom table when media photographers arrive. What I did for Vanguard Logistics never looked like that. I was the senior procurement officer who knew which manufacturing promise had been stretched too far, which shipping window could be accelerated without risking quality control, and which legal phrase would offend an overseas partner before corporate counsel in Manhattan even noticed it. That was why the Moretti family dealt with me directly. Not because I carried a flashy executive title, but because I spoke the truth without corporate varnish. If our logistics framework could meet a production deadline, I said yes. If it could not, I said no before anyone got trapped inside a polished corporate lie. Vanguard had spent 5 months damaging that relationship before I stepped off the plane in Florence. Unilateral schedule shifts, sudden discount demands, and corporate disrespect that upper management labels efficiency when directed overseas. I spent 18 days undoing that damage through precise, honest conversations. Yet Helena kept trying to inject herself into the final phase, demanding changes to presentation schedules, insisting on hardening contract language, and wanting her name on executive routing lists where it had never belonged. Small modifications on parchment are where catastrophic commercial failures begin. Complex agreements rarely collapse from one loud mistake. They get eroded by executive vanity that nobody inside the building has the courage to challenge. I had pushed back against her intervention at every turn, knowing that allowing unearned executive input into precision legal contracts would poison the entire relationship. The day before her call, Clara Gable from Human Resources issued a quiet warning during our check-in, urging me not to make the chief executive's wife feel excluded from strategic decisions. I knew precisely what that advice meant. Keep the work flawless, swallow your professional dignity, and satisfy executive egos regardless of the risk to the business. I had tolerated minor corporate politics for years, which was likely why Helena assumed I would submit one more time. Corporate leadership viewed me as a line director, holding a folder and a return ticket. They never realized I was holding the concession roadmap, the personal trust of our supplier, and the only viable version of Monday that still had a chance of closing. I did not pack my bags in anger, nor did I send an emotional email blast to executive leadership in New York. Experienced professionals know that when management chooses ego over competence, the most effective response is absolute clarity and documented evidence. On Friday evening, I composed a single formal message to Enzo Moretti and his chief legal counsel. I stated simply that, as of Thursday evening, I was no longer authorized to represent Vanguard Logistics in commercial negotiations due to internal management restructuring. For continuity and record-keeping purposes, I attached the final clean draft we had jointly reviewed and verified during our Thursday afternoon session. I copied Clara Gable in Human Resources and Executive Management in New York, ensuring every party possessed identical documentation. I did not include commentary, complaints, or emotional predictions. I allowed the record to stand completely unvarnished. That single email established an unbreakable baseline, proving that any subsequent alterations to the agreement were executed without my input or consent. It demonstrated that corporate counsel in New York was operating without lead negotiator verification. Mason Cross landed in Florence early Saturday morning, brimming with the inflated confidence of a corporate executive who has never had to earn the respect of a room through hard work. He checked into his luxury hotel, smoothed out his tailored linen suit, and walked into the Moretti Group headquarters carrying 2 items he trusted far too much: a newly altered contract folder and the unearned authority delegated by Helena Vance. The Saturday review meeting proceeded, a detail Helena would later cite as evidence that her operational intervention succeeded. However, it was no longer a negotiation aimed at finalizing an $18 million partnership. It had devolved into a cold, formal inquiry by seasoned European executives. There was no warmth, no shared coffee, and no lingering sense of 2 established enterprises preparing to seal a long-term commercial commitment. Enzo Moretti sat at the head of the dark oak table, opened the leather folder, scanned the first 3 pages, and looked directly at Mason. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, thick with the quiet disappointment of men who had spent decades building genuine industrial value. Enzo asked why the lead negotiator who had rebuilt this agreement over 18 days had been abruptly removed on the eve of execution. Mason offered the scripted response headquarters had provided him, citing internal structural optimization and routine corporate realignment across international operations. Enzo absorbed the answer with a slow, deliberate nod that signaled profound skepticism. He then turned to page 12 of the revised draft, pointing his finger at the altered dispute jurisdiction clause and the modified intellectual property language governed by Title 17 United States Code Section 106. He asked who had authorized these modifications and why management in New York considered it prudent to alter both legal terms and executive representation. 48 hours before formal execution, Mason attempted to maintain his rehearsed calm, explaining that leadership desired a streamlined authority structure going forward. Enzo closed the folder with a sharp, heavy thud that resonated across the silent room. "Streamlined for whom?" Enzo asked quietly, his eyes fixed on Mason. No one raised their voice, which made the atmosphere infinitely more dangerous for Vanguard Logistics. Enzo stated that Moretti Group would keep Monday morning on the schedule out of professional courtesy, but before a single signature was affixed to any document, his legal team would evaluate whether Vanguard Logistics possessed the basic governance stability required to honor an $18 million commitment. That single warning should have dispatched immediate shockwaves back to Manhattan. It did not. Back in New York over the weekend, Edward Vance and Helena attended a high-profile industry gala in Midtown. Edward believed the personnel adjustments was a minor administrative detail handled by human resources, while Helena sent Mason a late-night text message congratulating him on keeping the transaction moving forward. She interpreted the completion of Saturday's meeting as absolute victory, demonstrating how little she comprehended the delicate mechanics of international commerce. Throughout Sunday, corporate leadership remained convinced that Monday morning would yield an executive triumph. They mistook polite silence for agreement, formal protocol for consent, and a quiet conference room for executive control. They failed to realize that seasoned foreign partners do not engage in shouting matches when insulted by corporate hubris. They simply step back, inspect the governance risks, and prepare to protect their business assets through legal channels. While Helena was planning press announcements celebrating Vanguard's European expansion, Enzo Moretti's senior legal team was already drafting a formal response that would transform a routine Monday morning into an executive nightmare for Vanguard's board of directors. The stage was set for a corporate reckoning that money could not buy off. Every corporate officer who had signed off on the transition would soon have to answer to the board. Monday did not begin with dramatic office confrontations or raised voices in Manhattan. That quiet start was precisely what made the situation catastrophic for Vanguard Logistics. At 8 in the morning Eastern Time, before executive management had even finished morning coffee, an urgent electronic communication arrived from the Moretti Group legal department. Mason had been monitoring his inbox in Florence expecting a signed document. Instead, he opened a formal legal hold notice. It was brief, uncompromising, and delivered with surgical precision. The notice outlined 3 explicit reasons why Moretti Group was suspending all commercial activities with Vanguard Logistics. First, the unexplained removal of the lead negotiator without operational continuity protocols. Second, the unilateral alteration of core legal covenants without prior consultation. Third, deep concerns regarding Vanguard's corporate governance and whether informal family influence was dictating commercial decisions. When Clara Gable read the hold notice in New York, the color drained from her face completely. She immediately forwarded the document to corporate legal counsel and CEO Edward Vance. Within 20 minutes, an emergency conference call was convened including operations, legal, and human resources leadership. The narrative of a simple, routine staffing change collapsed instantly under legal scrutiny. This was no longer an overseas personnel dispute that could be swept under the rug. It was an international partner formally accusing Vanguard Logistics of operational instability and bad faith bargaining. Edward Vance stared at the document in silence, realizing for the first time that Grant Miller had not been managing a minor vendor trip. He had been single-handedly insulating Vanguard from an $18 million commercial disaster. As the emergency executive meeting assembled in Manhattan, Helena Vance attempted to dismiss the hold notice as an emotional overreaction by an old-fashioned European manufacturer. She insisted that Enzo Moretti was simply flexing his leverage and suggested that Mason Cross be instructed to take a firmer posture in Florence. Corporate legal counsel interrupted her immediately, their tone sharper than anyone in the building had ever heard before. Senior attorney Elliot Reynolds stated, flatly that this was not a vendor grievance, but a documented governance breakdown. He pointed out that altering signed intellectual property assurances under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, without lead negotiator approval, created immediate legal vulnerability for Vanguard Logistics. Furthermore, executing a major personnel displacement without documenting business cause exposed the firm to potential statutory violations under Title 29. United States Code Section 2101 of the WARN Act framework regarding arbitrary executive actions affecting international operations. Elliot Reynolds opened the digital audit trail behind my removal, placing printed email records onto the center of the boardroom table. He traced the timeline from Helena's initial complaint to Clara Gable's immediate termination notice. He noted that Helena held no elected officer position, no board vote, and no formal delegation of operational authority within Vanguard Logistics. By directing human resources to strip a senior director of commercial authority to satisfy personal grievances, she had exposed the firm to severe legal liability. Elliot highlighted potential claims involving breach of fiduciary duty, where corporate officers abdicate their independent judgment to non-executive family members. He also noted the risk of dissipation of corporate assets, given that her intervention directly imperiled an $18 million asset and incurred thousands of dollars in wasted operational expenditure. He stressed that personal influence over corporate contracts violated fundamental governance standards and fiduciary obligations. The atmosphere inside the executive suites turned suffocatingly heavy. CEO Edward Vance sat motionless as his senior legal counsel outlined how an informal phone call had jeopardized the company's entire European expansion strategy. Clara Gable attempted to defend her actions, claiming she was merely attempting to maintain executive alignment and prevent internal friction. Elliot Reynolds countered by asking whether maintaining alignment meant executing illegal directives that breached corporate bylaws and endangered international contracts. Clara had no answer. Operations Vice President Julian Ross tried to claim he had approved Mason's deployment to preserve transaction momentum. Elliot reminded him that deploying an unbriefed representative with unauthorized contract modifications constituted gross operational negligence across all management levels. The paper trail left no doubt regarding administrative failure and operational exposure. By noon on Monday, the commercial consequences began compounding exponentially across Vanguard's operational network. Domestic retail partners, expecting confirmed supply chain allocations for the upcoming retail quarter, requested immediate verification of manufacturing capacity. Merchandising leads informed executive management that if the Moretti agreement was not fully executed within 5 business days, retail delivery windows would be missed, triggering automatic penalty clauses totaling $450,000 per week. What Helena had envisioned as a quick lesson in personal hierarchy had evolved into a high-stakes financial disaster with a rapidly ticking clock. Corporate legal demanded full custody of all internal communications, text messages, and email records connected to the Moretti account over the preceding 30 days. By Monday afternoon, internal corporate investigators had begun auditing every electronic message sent between Helena Vance, Clara Gable, and Mason Cross. They discovered multiple internal notes where Helena explicitly demanded that Grant Miller be brought to heel and that his commercial leverage be reduced prior to contract signing. These records provided irrefutable evidence of intentional interference in an ongoing commercial transaction. The legal team made it clear to Edward Vance that if this matter escalated to public litigation, Vanguard would be entirely incapable of defending its actions in court. The documentation proved that Grant Miller had acted with total professional propriety, while executive leadership had allowed informal family influence to sabotage corporate governance. Meanwhile, in Florence, Mason Cross was sitting alone in his hotel lobby, realizing that his polished corporate career was on the verge of total collapse. Every attempt he made to secure a follow-up meeting with Enzo Moretti was rejected by Moretti Group Security. Enzo refused to take his calls, communicating exclusively through formal legal correspondence. Mason sent frantic emails to New York, requesting revised instructions, but headquarters was far too consumed by emergency legal meetings to offer him guidance. The young strategy coordinator who had flown across the Atlantic, expecting a triumphant victory lap, now found himself marooned in Italy, serving as the visible symbol of Vanguard's corporate folly. He knew his career at headquarters was functionally over and that his unearned arrogance had cost him everything. By Monday evening, the Executive Board's Risk Oversight Committee had been formally notified of the situation. While the full board of directors had not yet been convened, senior board members demanded an immediate briefing on how an $18 million expansion contract had been suspended within 72 hours. Edward Vance was forced to admit that informal personal dynamics had interfered with commercial operations. Board members issued a stern directive: resolve the Moretti dispute immediately, restore operational governance, and eliminate all non-executive interference from corporate procurement. The pressure on Edward Vance was no longer just commercial. His own position as chief executive was now directly threatened by the governance failure his wife had created. Tuesday morning arrived with Vanguard Logistics facing severe financial and operational paralysis across multiple corporate departments. Sourcing managers spent long hours sifting through my digital file archives, attempting to extract detailed negotiation histories, pricing formulas, and supplier concessions. They quickly discovered that while raw data can be saved in a database, genuine professional trust cannot be downloaded. My electronic notes contained spreadsheets and delivery schedules, but they could not capture the delicate personal agreements forged over 18 days in Florence. Sourcing officers could not replicate the verbal assurances regarding quality control, nor could they explain why specific liability limits had been accepted in exchange for flexible payment terms. Every attempt by internal teams to reconstruct the deal from paperwork only highlighted how indispensable my personal involvement had been to the entire corporate expansion. In a desperate bid to salvage his standing, Mason Cross drafted a self-serving clarification memorandum on Tuesday afternoon and transmitted it directly to Enzo Moretti. In his message, Mason assured Moretti Group that Vanguard's executive structure had been streamlined for maximum efficiency and that leadership in New York retained total confidence in the transaction. Hoping to curry favor with management, Mason added Helena Vance to the electronic copy list, believing her executive presence would signal high-level alignment. The maneuver backfired disastrously. Enzo Moretti responded 23 minutes later, with a brief message copied directly to Vanguard's board of directors. Enzo stated unequivocally that Moretti Group did not conduct $18 million commercial negotiations through informal family visibility lists and demanded written legal certification detailing who possessed actual, unencumbered statutory authority to bind Vanguard Logistics. Enzo's sharp response sent shockwaves through Vanguard's executive floor in Manhattan. Merchandising directors reported that inventory allocations for 90 retail locations were now frozen, while finance officers calculated that delay penalties were accumulating at a rate of $65,000 daily. The financial model showed that if the deadlock persisted past Friday, Vanguard would suffer irreversible reputational and financial damage. The narrative that Helena had constructed, portraying me as an arrogant employee who needed to be disciplined, had completely disintegrated under the weight of commercial reality. Senior management realized that my firm refusal to yield to Helena's vanity was not stubbornness. It was the precise protective posture required to shield Vanguard from disaster. By Wednesday morning, corporate legal counsel took absolute control of the crisis management team. Elliot Reynolds summoned CEO Edward Vance, Clara Gable, and Julian Ross to an enforcement meeting. Elliot informed them that all direct communication between Helena Vance and corporate procurement was officially severed, warning that any further interference would be treated as a direct breach of corporate fiduciary duties under state law and internal bylaws. Clara Gable was asked to explain why Human Resources had executed an adverse employment action against a senior director without conducting a risk analysis or verifying statutory compliance under Title 29 United States Code Section 2101. Clara had no legal defense, admitting she had acted under implicit pressure from executive leadership. Elliot Reynolds then addressed Julian Ross, demanding to know why operations had endorsed, replacing an experienced lead negotiator with an unqualified candidate hours before contract execution. Julian conceded that he had failed to evaluate the commercial risks, assuming human resources had properly vetted the transition. Elliot responded coldly, noting that executive incompetence had exposed Vanguard to potential litigation involving forgery under Section 470 of the California Penal Code, had any unauthorized signatures been appended to modified documents without proper board delegation. The legal team made it abundantly clear that the only mechanism to prevent total contract forfeiture was to re-engage Grant Miller immediately under terms defined entirely by him. Late Wednesday afternoon, Elliot Reynolds placed a direct call to my personal phone in Florence. The tone of corporate leadership had undergone a complete transformation. Gone was the condescending posture and corporate intimidation that Helena Vance had exhibited days earlier. Elliot spoke with profound professional respect, acknowledging that Vanguard Logistics had committed severe operational and governance errors. He did not offer empty corporate apologies or decorative reassurances. Instead, he asked what precise conditions were required for me to assume full control of the Moretti account, repair the commercial relationship, and guide the $18 million contract across the finish line. I listened calmly, knowing that after 24 hours of corporate panic, the balance of power had returned entirely to hands that understood how to build real value. I did not respond to Elliot Reynolds' inquiry with emotion or immediate concession. I informed him that before I would engage in substantive conversations with Moretti Group, Vanguard Logistics must execute a binding, formal resolution addressing the governance failures that had created the crisis. On Thursday morning, I transmitted my non-negotiable terms to corporate legal counsel. First, Helena Vance must be permanently barred from all operational communications, procurement routing lists, and vendor management visibility, enforced through formal board policy. Second, my executive authority as Senior Director of Global Procurement must be fully reinstated, backed by a written delegation of authority executed by the Board of Directors, establishing that no commercial revisions could be made without my explicit written authorization. Third, the Moretti contract draft must immediately revert to the Clean Friday version I had negotiated, purging all unauthorized executive modifications. Fourth, human resources must establish a binding continuity protocol preventing the arbitrary removal of lead negotiators during live cross-border transactions. Vanguard's executive leadership had run completely out of alternatives. By Thursday afternoon, CEO Edward Vance signed the board delegation of authority, while Clara Gable formally documented the operational continuity protocols in human resources records. With the binding legal framework fully executed, Elliot Reynolds convened a joint tri-party conference call connecting Manhattan, Florence, and my hotel room. During the call, I spoke directly to Enzo Moretti, presenting the fully executed corporate delegation establishing my exclusive statutory authority over the account. Upon reviewing the verified documentation and confirming that the agreement had reverted to our Clean Friday draft, Enzo's cold demeanor vanished. He agreed to reopen the formal execution path, scheduling the final commercial signing for Friday morning at 9 o'clock. On Friday morning, I walked back into the Moretti Group headquarters in Florence, carrying the clean $18 million contract folder. The atmosphere in the boardroom was once again warm, professional, and built on mutual respect. Enzo Moretti greeted me with a firm handshake, acknowledging that true commercial strength is demonstrated by professionals who protect the integrity of their agreements against internal and external pressure. Within 45 minutes, all formal execution signatures were completed, securing Vanguard's European expansion and protecting retail distribution schedules across 90 locations. Mason Cross sat silently at the far end of the table, serving as a mute spectator to a successful negotiation he had nearly destroyed. The operational fallout inside Vanguard Logistics was swift and uncompromising. Helena Vance was permanently stripped of all informal corporate access, Her ability to influence procurement decisions terminated by binding board resolution. Clara Gable received a formal written reprimand on her corporate record for violating employment continuity protocols under Title 29 United States Code Section 2101, permanently ending her prospects for executive advancement. Julian Ross lost unilateral authority over international personnel assignments, his operational domain subjected to mandatory oversight by corporate legal counsel. Edward Vance retained his title as Chief Executive Officer, but his professional standing was severely diminished, his authority curtailed by a board of directors that no longer trusted his governance judgment. Vanguard Logistics presented me with a choice upon my return to New York. I was offered an elevated executive compensation package of $350,000 annually, complete with total operational autonomy over global procurement, or the option to execute an executive severance package worth 2 years of full salary. After thorough consideration, I elected to remain with Vanguard under my newly established terms. I did not stay out of loyalty to corporate leadership or attachment to a brand name. I stayed because the balance of authority had been permanently corrected. My name sat at the top of every commercial procurement directive as lead commercial negotiator, backed by bulletproof governance policies that no executive spouse could ever tamper with again. For experienced professionals who spend their lives building genuine value in complex industries, the lesson of this experience is clear. Loud corporate authority and unearned privilege may dominate quiet rooms for a moment, but they cannot sustain real business operations when pressure strikes. When arrogant leadership attempts to convert your professional dedication into a lesson in submission, you do not need to engage in loud arguments or emotional outbursts. You simply maintain meticulous documentation, stand firmly on legal and operational truth, and allow their unearned vanity to crash against the unyielding wall of commercial reality. In the end, real power does not belong to those who hold loud titles. It belongs to those whose quiet competence keeps the entire structure from collapsing.